This presentation is about the main theoretical approaches to understanding motivation and decision-making. By the end of the session, you should be able to describe what's meant by motivation and its role in generating behaviour, evaluate a variety of theoretical approaches to understanding motivation, describe what's meant by decision-making and its role in motivation, and to evaluate broad theoretical approaches to understanding decision-making. Let's start by considering, first of all, what we mean by motivation. And I'm going to be a little bit more specific and use the term behavioural motivation, specifically to look at mental processes and dispositions that energise and direct behaviour. The broader term of motivation could relate to all sorts of other things like, motivated thinking and motivated feeling and so on. But motivation here is, when we talk about it, we're looking at behavioural motivation. That's motivation that's underpinning behaviour. And the key things to note here are that it's all the mental processes and dispositions, that's tendencies that we have, things that we hold within our brains that lead us to behave in particular ways. And they energize, that's they get behavior going, and they direct it. So their role in generating behavior is in initiating it, in choosing what behaviors we're going to enact, to deactivating behaviour, stopping or preventing a behaviour, in persistence, in continuing our efforts towards a goal despite obstacles, for example, and intensity, the concentration and vigour in which we engage in the behaviour. Crucial thing to note is that motivation, unlike what you'll see in the literature, or a lot of the literature, is about much more than just goals and reasons for doing things. So if you look up sort of standard dictionary definitions or even go onto AI and ask about motivation, it'll keep going on about goal-directed behaviour. But motivation is much more than that. You can divide it up into three kinds of concepts: thought-related concepts, feeling-related, and impulse-related. So you've got things like goals, intentions, decisions, preferences, values, evaluations, and so on. You've got feeling-related things, urges, desires, wants, needs, attraction, and so on and so forth. And you've got impulse-related things like a habit and instinct, and the word impulse and inhibition, compulsions and reflexes. And it's very important to understand that all of these are involved in motivation. It's not just our intentional behaviours that we're dealing with. So when we look at the motivational theories, there are quite a few different approaches, and I'm going to go very, very quickly and briefly through each of them, just to give you a flavour for what they cover, and then we're going to look at their strengths and limitations. The theories include rational choice theories, irrational choice theories, associative learning theories, emotion theories, drive theories, self-regulation theories, personality theories, social influence theories, needs and value-based theories, and habit theories. And all of those have quite a strong basis in empirical work, and each of them captures important features of our motivation. But what you'll see as we go along is that each of them only captures part of the story. So let's just have a look, starting with rational choice theories. So the core idea behind these, and these really dominate the world of economics and behavioural economics, is that people make decisions by weighing up the costs and benefits of the options in order to maximise their what they call utility. So an example of that would be a very well-known theory called subjective expected utility theory, or SEU theory. I won't go into the details, but you can look it up. So essentially, the idea is that, as this is the sort of the common sense view, if you like, of human behaviour and motivation, is that when our behaviours are driven by our evaluations of things that are good about what we're thinking about doing and bad about what we're thinking about doing, and we weigh those up, and then we decide what it is that we're going to do. And there's lots of different versions of these theories, all focusing on different aspects. Strengths are they do provide clear testable predictions, and have done, that they do quite a good job in explaining our deliberate choices. They have been found to be fairly useful in economics and policy, although with limitations. And in theory, they can be specified with a high degree of mathematical precision. The limitations are that, of course, most obviously, they assume rationality, and we know for sure that that is a very unwise assumption. It's not that we're never rational or that rationality doesn't play a role, but it is only part of the picture. That they fail to adequately address our emotions and our biases. They don't account for our habitual behaviours. And to be honest, even in economics, when you use them as the underpinning of economic models, they have very, very limited real-world accuracy. And in fact, people deviate from them in quite predictable ways sometimes, and sometimes quite unpredictable ways. So that then takes us to the irrational choice theories. The core idea is that people systematically deviate from rational decisions due to various cognitive biases and heuristics that we operate. It's still a choice theory. That the idea still is very much that our behaviours are driven by consideration of alternatives, and we're going to come to look at decision making a bit later in this talk. But that it recognises that we don't always behave in optimal or rational ways. Now, a classic example of this is what's known as prospect theory. This is a theory that helped to win a Nobel Prize for Danny Kahneman, and is used quite well. I would say it is kind of used in behavioral economics, but it's not widely used in mainstream economics, partly because mainstream economics has a very, should we say, limited view of human behaviour, and partly it's actually quite hard to operationalise it in a way that works well with macroeconomic models. But nevertheless, it's certainly a sort of step up on the sort of traditional economic theories, and there would be merits in it being used more often. It is closer to real-world behaviour. It does identify systematic patterns of deviation from rationality. It has some practical implications in terms of the way you intervene to affect people's choices. And there is some evidence to support it empirically, although often a lot of the support comes in hypothetical decision-making scenarios rather than real-world situations. Limitations are that it doesn't really go into why the biases exist, where they come from. A lot of the biases are not really necessarily what you actually see in the real world. They often occur in quite sort of contrived, artificial situations. Sometimes it can lack predictive power. And one of the issues is that it tends to focus more on how irrational we are and our errors rather than our strengths. Those are just examples of the kind of limitations that we observe with those theories. And then going back in history, but incredibly important, are what we call the associative learning theories, such as operant learning theory and classical conditioning. And the idea here is that our motivations are learnt through associations between one thing and another. Classically, for example, reward and punishment. If you take a behaviour and you consistently reward it, then that behaviour is more likely to occur. And if you punish it, it's less likely to occur. That's very obvious and something that we all know happens. What's very interesting about these theories is that they link us, if you like, with other species because you see the same phenomena in other species, and including species where you wouldn't say there was any real decision making going on. So these associative learning processes occur often at a non-conscious level and don't necessarily involve a formal decision. There's something that occurs very naturally and very rapidly in terms of the way our mental processes operate. So that when we behave in particular ways because we've been rewarded and punished for them, we're not even necessarily that aware of what's going on. We just know that we like this thing and we find ourselves doing it. Or we find ourselves avoiding certain things without even necessarily having to have insight into why. Also, very strong element of these theories is that they go far, far beyond just noting that rewards increase the likelihood of behaviours and punishments, decrease it into precisely what patterning of reward and what patterning of punishment has what kind of effect. So, for example, showing that if you reward behaviours intermittently, you can get much stronger patterns of behaviour that are more resistant to extinction, as it's called, than if you reward it continuously, which seems a bit counterintuitive. But if you reward behaviours intermittently and randomly, you actually get stronger behaviours. And that's the basis, for example, for why people very often, or one of the bases that people get so hooked on gaming and gambling, is because you get this unpredictable intermittent reward. So it has very strong empirical support. It explains the way that we form habits. There's very clearly set out mechanisms. We even have a pretty good idea about the brain mechanisms underpinning it. And it has very strong practical applications and is widely used in clinical psychology, for example, but also in marketing and other areas. So it's a very profound set of theories that we absolutely must pay attention to. The limitations are that it does tend to oversimplify human behaviour and tend to neglect our conscious reasoning and decision-making processes, and it doesn't explain the insights that we often have into our behaviours. Next, we come to our emotion theories. These are theories which look at how our emotions such as love, anger, anxiety, depression and so on, our likes and dislikes and so on influence behaviours by signalling what's important and energising our behaviours. And there's a whole raft of these, or an example is differential emotions theory, but they really underpin a large amount of the kind of work that's done in understanding motivations, how our emotions influence the way that we feel in terms of wanting or needing to do things. Strengths of these kinds of approaches are that they recognise the role of feelings, which is incredibly important. They explain the fact that very often our responses are very rapid and not thought through. They occur very quickly and often automatically. These theories also integrate physiological processes into the explanations and have quite high ecological validity because we know how important emotions are in driving our behaviours. Limitations are that they often fail to capture our judgment processes. What's going on under the hood, as it were, is often very difficult to measure, and we don't often have very good consistent, reliable ways of capturing some of these things that we're interested in. They often fail to capture our habits and our abilities to self-regulate. So those aren't really often covered in these kinds of theories. Then we have the drive theories. These are theories which go back many, many decades into understanding the role of hunger, thirst, and sex drives and other kinds of drives that underpin a lot of our behaviours. And these have been pretty well elaborated, particularly in terms of psychophysiology. And so the idea here is that we have kind of homeostatic mechanisms that our bodies need in order to maintain integrity, and that those can be very important in motivating our behaviours. Strengths of these kinds of theories are that they go a long way towards understanding and explaining our basic needs that keep us alive. We have a pretty good understanding now of the brain processes and the other hormonal and other processes that underpin them, which of course, many of you will know has led to the new raft of weight control drugs, which can be very effective as long as people take them. They also allow us to see how we compare with other species. A lot of the kind of mechanisms involved are ones that we share with other species as well, and they produce testable predictions. I'm not giving you a comprehensive list of strengths and limitations here. This is just really a flavour of the kinds of considerations you have when thinking about these theories. Limitations are that they've often been considered a bit reductionist. They don't consider the wider complexities of our behaviours, including the social factors and so on. They very often don't explain all of our behaviour. By no means all of our behaviour is driven by these kinds of biological processes. Tend to focus on deficits that we have, like hunger and so on, rather than positive anticipation of positive experiences, and they typically fail to account for social motives. And an example of this kind of theory is drive reduction theory. Then you've got the self-regulation theories. These are theories really important in areas such as addiction and so on, but actually in many areas of life where particularly health-related behaviours, for example, or behaviours around environmental sustainability, where essentially our immediate desires and impulses are taking us in one direction, but we have goals, self-declared goals and intentions that take us in another direction, and we want to understand how far and in what circumstances people go after their goals rather than being swayed this way and that by their immediate environment or their immediate needs and so on. So the core idea is that behaviours often require an ability to pursue goals, but these conflict with more immediate impulses and desires. Strengths of this kind of approach are that they help to understand variation in goal achievement. For example, in the way that our upbringing trains us to subjugate our immediate emotional or other kinds of needs to longer term goals. Socialization is very important in that process. It links capability with motivation in that we can think very often of the ability to self-regulate. It's a very natural thing to do, to think, well, to what extent can we train or improve people's capabilities to enact the goals that they set themselves in the face of more immediate desires and impulses. These theories integrate cognition and emotion pretty well, and they have some very obvious and important, useful practical applications. Limitations are that not all behaviours require self-regulation, so they're only covering a certain part of this space. They also introduce this sort of idea of agency, or the sort of what's been known in the past as the homunculus, the person within the machine, like who's sitting at the driving wheel of our brains, and that is something that philosophers have struggled with for a long time. We have this sense of ego, of who we are, that somehow is looking out the window of our eyes and doing this controlling. But of course, in reality, we just have the one brain, and the whole brain is interacting in ways that create that sense. And it does sort of preserve that idea of a person behind the person, as it were. One of the main theories is called ego depletion theory, and it was thought that this was quite a nice explanation for why it is, for example, that after having exercised a lot of self-control for a certain period of time, sometimes people really find it hard to keep going with that exercise of self-control. Unfortunately, the evidence for ego depletion is rather limited, interestingly, but nevertheless, the idea that it is effortful to exercise self-control is potentially important. And also it often fails to consider the really complex social, biological and psychological interactions that occur underpinning motivation. And then we're on number 7 of 10 of these things. But what you can see is there's an awful lot of these theories and theoretical approaches, and they're all taking a somewhat different view of what is essentially supposed to be the same thing, ultimately, motivation. And so this is what we're going to come to at the end, is how, we really need to pull all these things together. Anyway, what about personality theories? So personality theories, also very important, used a lot in occupational psychology, for example, but in areas of clinical psychology and so on as well, is that there are stable individual differences in traits and dispositions, and these shape our motivations. And the 5-factor theory is probably the most widely used one now, which says that across all cultures, there's 5 broad dimensions on which we can all locate ourselves, which we vary to different degrees. And these are pretty stable over time and start pretty early in life. And the 5 factors are extroversion versus introversion, conscientiousness versus non-conscientiousness, openness, which is being open to experience and so on, as opposed to being rather rigid and closed. What they call agreeableness, which is being nice to people or being horrible. And the 4th one is trait anxiety, or what in other theories is called neuroticism. And so each of us can be placed somewhere in a sort of profile of these 5 things. Now, it's not to say that these explain all of our behaviours, because obviously they don't, but they are potentially useful ways of characterising stable differences in the way that our motivations are formed. They do have predictive validity, they do have cross-cultural generalizability very often, and they do lead to practical applications, for example, in selection for certain kind of roles. Limitations are that they're often quite descriptive rather than explanatory. They very often lead us to underestimate the importance of situations in controlling our behaviours, and that is a very, very classic human trait called the fundamental attribution error. Fundamental attribution error, learn that term if you don't already know it, which is a tendency for us to, when we see someone behaving in a particular way, assume that it's something about them that is behaving in that way, rather than the situation in which they find themselves. We do it all the time. All the time. It's a very common trait. And personality theories can lead us down that path. So always beware of that pitfall. They're not terribly well integrated into motivational theories, and they very often fail to capture social factors. And then we have, speaking of social factors, the social influence theories. And the idea here is that we want to focus on the social environment, our groups, our families, our wider cultures and so on, and how they influence our behaviours through things like social norms, the relationships we have in the cultural context. And these are incredibly important. They do help to explain our social behaviour. They do help to understand cultural sensitivities. They do cover the role of things like group dynamics, and they have strong real-world relevance. The limitations are that they're not terribly well integrated with other motivational theories. They often actually, interestingly, neglect cultural variation by virtue of focusing on a particular culture or cultural norms and so on, and assuming that other cultures behave similarly when very often they don't. So there's a bit of a sort of double-edged sword there. And they often neglect individual differences of the sort that would be captured by personality theories and so on. And of course, not all motivations are social, so they're only covering part of the picture. And then number 9 on our list are what I'm calling needs and values-based theories, also very, very widely used, very important. And they work on the principle that motivation is based essentially on some psychological needs that we have. A very, very popular example of this is self-determination theory, which argues that we have a certain small number of psychological needs and that these underpin a lot of our emotions. strengths are that they consider what matters to people. They have strong intuitive appeal. In theory, they can address a wide range of needs and values. In practice, unfortunately, they typically don't, but they could. And they have real-world relevance, because if we can understand what it is in terms of people's needs and their values that are driving their behaviours, then we can help to understand their motivations, and then we can also help to influence them. They don't cover typically things like habits. Very often they're not very clear about what they mean by needs and values. And often, I would argue with self-determination theory, for example, they're very culturally blinkered in the sense that they're coming from a particular perspective, in the case of self-determination theory, from a sort of Western individualist perspective, when in fact there's lots and lots of other needs and values that other cultures will have that are much more powerful than we give them credit for. So these are limitations typically of the sorts of theories that you see in this space. And then finally, but not least by any means, you've got the habit theories, which are that essentially motivation is driven by our automatic habits, which could be learned, for example, through associative learning. They account for the role of automaticity in motivation. They do provide insights into our little micro behaviors, things that we often don't really focus on, don't think about, and don't have control over. They can explain how our behaviors can change and how we can create persistent behaviors over time, and have strong real-world relevance. Habit training is potentially a very important part of behavior change generally. Limitations are that they focus on habits. That's what they do. And so they don't really cover all those things that these other theories are covering in terms of reflective motivational processes. And they don't really consider needs and drives terribly. They have very little consideration of how motivations change. Apart from, in terms of the needs and drives, they're focusing more on how habits develop and are extinguished. And they also really don't look terribly well at how we resolve conflict. So when we've got things working in opposite directions, how does that then turn into particular dispositions to behave in particular ways? Okay, so we've had a look at motivational theories, and you can see there's an awful lot of them, and they all have insights. There's no question about it. Each approach captures something really useful and important about motivation, but what you can also see is that they're quite selective, and each one of them is only covering a certain part of the picture. Now let's look at decision making and how that fits into the overall picture. Well, decision-making has been defined in lots of different ways, but what we're going to look at here is the process of selecting one or more courses of action from multiple alternatives. Now, it may be just one course of action if you're selecting a person for a job, or it may be multiple courses of action. You may select 2 or 3 people out of 10 or whatever. So it's narrowing down your selection very often to one course of action, but it doesn't have to be one. Now, where does it fit into motivation? Well, what happens is that a lot of the time we just go about doing things that we do. We're not really thinking terribly about what the options are. But every now and then we're faced with either an opportunity, a threat, or a task, a job that we have to do or that we set ourselves, in which we are faced with the idea that, well, I could do this or I could do that, or I could do this or not do this. And so that's when our brain's sort of decision-making apparatus kicks in and we think, right, I'm going to make a decision about this. So the kind of decisions we're talking about are ones in which people reflect on what they do before they do it. And it doesn't have to be for a very long period of time. It could be for a second. It could be for 2 seconds. It could be over months. It literally could be over years. Decision-making covers all of those things. It's when we stop and think about what it is we're going to do, whether we're going to do something or not, or whether we're going to do this thing or that thing or something else. That's what we're interested in when we're talking about decision-making. And I've been involved in developing a a way of understanding real-world decision-making, the kind of really complex decision-making that takes place in all of our lives, over the last few months, actually, and years, which is coming to a head now with the publication of a book which should be coming out next year. And in that process, what's become apparent is that the best way, or a good way, shall we say, of understanding the process of decision making is to compartmentalize it into four different sections. How we frame the decision. That's, for example, whether we think, shall I do this or not, or shall I do this or something else, or what shall I do, or when shall I do it, how much should I spend on X? That's the framing of the decision. The assessing of the options, the information gathering, how we evaluate the information, and so on. The comparing, once we have got our information about the options, how do we decide which option or options we're going to go for? And then finally, the enacting, the process which turns that comparison into the final decision, which we then put into effect. And I'll give you a link at the end to a Substack and a set of Substack posts and podcasts which cover this in more detail. But essentially, what we're doing in decision making is we're translating our evaluations, goals, and desires into intentions. Decision making doesn't necessarily result in behavior, it results in intentions. And those intentions may or may not go on to influence behavior. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail on this because of time, but there are two main theoretical frameworks that are used to understand how people make decisions. One is through pros and cons comparisons of the sort that I talked about in understanding motivation, which is evaluating the advantages and disadvantages of different options. Subjective expected utility theory is one example, prospect theory is an example, theory of planned behavior is an example, multi-attribute utility theory is an example. You can put this into AI and get lots of examples of different types of decision-making models that are all based on the idea that when we make decisions, we evaluate the pros and the cons. And you might think, well, that's all you need to know, but it isn't, because there's a whole other raft of decision models which are very important, which are based on if-then rules, where you're not evaluating the advantages and disadvantages of the different options. You're saying you're matching your situation to a sort of set of templates that you have in your head or written down on paper. And so under certain conditions, I'll do this. If A, B, C, and D, then do this. If X, Y, and Z, then do something else. And those are equally important. And in reality, in the real world of decision making, which is what the book that will be coming out next year called Reflect, the science of real world decision making. In the real world, a lot of our decisions are a kind of mixture of the two. And one of the slightly frustrating things about the science of decision making is that what you'll see is it's very compartmentalized into understanding one approach or another approach. If we look at the pros and cons comparison idea, the idea that decision makers weigh the advantages and disadvantages of each option, then strengths are that yes, they capture comparative processes fairly well. They provide a natural way of modeling the choices, and you can do that mathematically, or you can do that in more informal ways. They can be flexible enough to capture irrational processes like prospect theory does. And they can provide clearly a basis for practical applications, because if you think that someone's let's say they're deciding whether or not to install solar panels in a home, if you make installing solar panels cheaper, easier, and generally more attractive, then more people will install solar panels. So it makes very good sense from a practical point of view. The limitations are that it does fail to capture rule-based decision-making, which are this other kind of decision-making approach, which is if A and B but not C, then do this. And it also tends to treat decision-making as though it was something that all happened in one go rather than over time. And dynamic factors are incredibly important. Temporal factors are amazingly important in the decisions we eventually make. So, for example, when we're thinking about the solar panel issue, typically, what you'll do is you'll get some information, you'll think about it for a bit, you'll get some more information, maybe think about it for a bit. You may think, well, I'm leaning towards getting solar panels, but then something happens and you forget about it for a while. These kinds of factors are incredibly important in behaviour and what actually happens in the end. And these kinds of decision models tend not to capture that terribly well. They often fail to take account sufficiently of real-world contextual factors, social factors and other things that come into play, and very often lead to inappropriate interventions because they haven't captured those factors. And then when it comes to the if-then rules, the idea here is, as I've said, that decisions are made using these conditional rules. If A, B, and C, and so on, then do this. And this is very good for decision-making or way of capturing decision-makings that we often make in our professional lives. If you're a GP in your surgery, a patient comes to you with a set of symptoms. You ask them about their family history and you find out, yes, they've got a family history of heart disease, that their lipid levels are raised a bit, that they're experiencing some chest pain on exertion and so on. You're forming a picture, A, B, C, and D, and that then will lead you to a diagnosis, which will lead you potentially to a decision to refer, for example, for an angiogram or to prescribe statins. You're not weighing up the pros and cons there. You're working to a sort of formula that either has been sort of suggested to you by your practice guidelines or more widely, or something that you've decided on yourself. And these are incredibly important types of decisions. So it captures those pretty well. Can be turned also into testable simulations. You can turn a computer to create these kind of if-then rules, and you can then make predictions which you can then test. It does do a pretty good job at showing how different experts differ from each other in terms of the kinds of if-then rules that they operate, and can account for contextual sensitivity quite well. Limitations are that they do often oversimplify, they often don't really cover value conflicts, and they obviously they're not designed to cover the comparative evaluations that are covered by the pros-cons analysis. So there are limitations to both of these approaches, and ideally what we're looking for is an approach that covers both of them. So just to summarize then, motivation consists of all the mental processes energizing and directing all of our behavior, not just our goal-directed behavior, including the processes including thoughts, feelings, and impulses. The main theoretical approaches address what kinds of motivation exist, how they're formed, and how they're combined in order to influence behavior. Each of these theoretical approaches captures some insights, but they neglect others. Decision-making is the process of selecting from among two or more courses of action. It involves framing, assessing, comparing, and enacting. It's triggered by opportunities, threats, and tasks, and the result of the decision-making process is an intention. And there are two broad theoretical approaches involving modelling decisions in terms of a pros-cons analysis and if-then rules. Each of those two approaches captures some aspects of decision-making but not others, and both fail adequately to address context and dynamic factors. So that's the the basis of what we're talking about here. If you want to learn more about this, then there are two sources of information apart from the reading lists. I've started a Substack called Unlocking Behaviour Chajnge, in which we've done 20-something episodes now, all about decision making and motivation, and a YouTube channel as well, which has podcasts on these things as well as videos.